Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this, the 12th, I believe, webinar in this Get in Shape series, which means that we've been doing this series now for a little over 6 months. So it's fantastic to have you with us. I hope you're finding this series useful. Today, we've got a really important webinar to cover, and we've got a large audience coming to this one, which is fantastic to see. It's all around understanding conflicts of interest and managing gifts and incentives. And for such an important topic, we have an all-star panel. I'm really proud to introduce, we've got Karty Mayne from Rosewill Consulting, who is one of the stars. In fact, I'd be a little bit biased probably when I say the star of the compliance consulting industry, former manager of one of the supervision teams at the FMA, and also worked with closely on our Partners Life Advisor support program for anybody who's used that. We have Alistair Robertson, who's a star-powered lawyer from MinterEllisonRuddWatts, one of the contributors to our recent disclosure guidance note that came out on Monday. And we have from the Financial Markets Authority, Michael Hewes. So we have the voice of the man in this one to give us the definitive answers in some cases, which will be tremendously helpful. So thank you very much, Karty, Alistair, and Michael, for joining us today. I feel like I should pause for a moment to let the cheering die down. And then we'll change slides and get into the presentation. So before we begin, I just want to give you a quick recap of the previous session. We covered the new disclosure regulations and how to practically implement them into your business. And then on Monday, we launched, you can see an image on the right-hand side of the screen there, a guidance note of how to practically implement this disclosure from the 15th of March next year. And what we've done in this guidance note is we've taken some example generic type advisors, an investment advisor, one who does mortgage and insurance, one who does KiwiSaver and so forth, and followed their journey through the disclosure from the website, through the stuff that you might put, for example, in your scope of engagement letter, through what you put into your statement of advice, and then finally what you disclose if a client makes a complaint. So it's all very heavily example-based with some upfront information about how to make, about making it prominent and effective and concise and those sorts of things. So if you haven't already seen that, go to getinshape.nz and download that disclosure guide. I'm sure you'll find it a tremendously valuable resource. And remember, of course, through this webinar, if you've got any questions, pop them into Q&A. I'm going to be monitoring Q&A while the smart people are talking and firing the questions through to them. And the past webinars that we've got on this series are all available on the FSC YouTube channel, or you can just go to getinshape.nz and find the links to all the past webinars, and also the slides are available there as well. So without further ado, I believe I will hand it on to Karty to talk through the agenda of the session. Welcome, Karty.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for such a glowing introduction. I think I'm still blushing. Morning, everyone. So I'm just going to quickly walk you through the agenda. So our focus today it's all about conflicts of interest and really understanding them, and talking about conflicts of interest, gifts, and incentives. And we're lucky enough here to have both the legal interpretation as well as the regulatory overview and expectation. So I think you'll find it a really helpful session and really timely. One of the reasons for planning this session today was really coinciding with you preparing for what you need to put into your new disclosure type documents and explanations heading into the new regime. So the first part is really, I guess, a bit more theory about your obligations and unpacking conflicts of interest. In the second half, we're going to go deeper into the disclosure requirements and perhaps some examples of disclosures and some tips on good practice going forward. So Alistair, I'll hand over to you to step us through our obligations.
Thanks very much, Karty. So those who don't know me, I'm Alistair Robertson. I'm a special counsel in the MinterEllisonRuddWatts financial services team, formerly actually in ANZ compliance. So I've got sort of a foot on both sides of the fence on the legal and compliance side. But anyway, on to the topic at hand. So essentially, obligations for financial advisors and financial advice providers under the new legislation in relation to conflicts of interest arise under three broad headings. First of all, there is a new duty under the advice provisions of the FMCA, which is the sort of primary substantive duty in terms of management of conflicts of interest, which will include conflicts of interest which arise as a result of commissions or incentives. And that provides that in giving advice, an advisor must give priority to C, being the client's interests, by taking all reasonable steps to ensure that the advice is not materially influenced by the advisor's own interests or the interests of a person connected with the giving of the advice. That's backed up essentially by a new duty under the Code of Professional Conduct, which requires a person who gives financial advice to act with integrity. That includes avoiding or appropriately managing any conflicts of interest. And of course, there are specific requirements under the disclosure regulations in terms of how conflicts of interests and commissions and incentives must be disclosed. Before moving on, I just make a couple of points around the scope of the duty and the definition of what a conflict of interest is, and in particular, what a person connected with the giving of the advice means. The takeaway, I guess, on that is that that's a very broad definition, a person connected with the giving of the advice. It includes associated persons of the advisor, associated persons of the financial advice provider, and also any interposed person and associated person of that interposed person, if you have that structure. Associated person is also very broad, so it includes things like directors, senior managers of corporates, 25% or more shareholders in corporates. It also includes relatives, which is broad enough to capture an interest of your nephew or niece. So perhaps wider than you might initially think. And it also includes trustees of family trusts. So I guess the takeaway is when considering conflicts of interest, you need to ensure that you are covering and considering the full scope of persons whose interests you need to be identifying when you're thinking about how to manage those duties. We could move on to the next slide, Jenny. So what is a conflict of interest? So that's defined, and this is defined in the disclosure regulations. That's probably not strictly speaking the definition that applies under the Act, but I think it's probably the best pointer to how it will be interpreted. It's defined as any interest of the person giving the advice, the financial advice provider, or another person connected with the giving of the advice, so which we just talked about, that a reasonable client would expect to or be likely to materially influence the advice given by the advisor. So key points there are the assessment of whether there's a conflict of interest needs to be performed from the basis of what a reasonable client would think. So you have to put yourself in the client's shoes, the shoes of a reasonable client, and it has to be likely to materially influence the advice given, which was a modification that was made to the disclosure regulations during the consultation process. Previously, I think it was just influence the advice given. So there is a materiality threshold that you can apply in terms of determining whether there is a conflict of interest or not. And next slide, thanks. I believe that's back to you now, Karty.
Yeah, thanks, Alistair. So the next two slides are my go-to slides. So apologies to anyone who's seen them before, but a lot of the presentations that I've done, people have said, look, I'm an independent advisor. I really don't see that there are any conflicts of interest in my situation. So I've developed these couple of slides to try help people understand where conflicts of interest can arise, and really understanding that you may have an actual conflict of interest arise where there could be interests that could influence the decision making or the advice. There could be apparent, there could be potential, might not have even happened yet, or it could be political. So I guess the key message out of this is if someone perceives a conflict of interest, then you actually have to deal with it as a conflict of interest, whether there's a true actual conflict in there or not. So we need to think really quite widely and broadly about how customers and other key stakeholders will consider a situation, and if in doubt, don't have any shades of grey. It's better to be upfront, be transparent about any potential conflicts of interest and deal with them appropriately, and it just makes it a lot safer for you as the advisor. So on our next slide, Jenny, this is a slide that I've developed. I did some research into, okay, out of all the conflicts of interest that could potentially be out there for advisors and financial services type businesses. What are the key conflicts of interest risks for financial institutions? And really trying to sort of break it down into where they might crop up. And you can see that there's sort of two. There's one that could impact you personally, such as nepotism or self-dealing or gifts outside employment, some of your relationships. And then there's some that could impact the business dealings. So things like maybe insider trading, if you're working in a fund manager business, or you've got associated persons, as Alistair points out, sort of relationships where you could access information, bribery and kickbacks. Luckily, we're low in that in New Zealand, but it's one of those things that we need to keep New Zealand aware of and keep that out here. But related parties, I think, is quite a big one from a licensing perspective. So what we say here is make sure that you really understand the definition of a related party, and that any related party transactions are likely to be material to investors or to your clients and should be disclosed in any disclosure document. So I just really wanted to sort of highlight that one as being a key one to be aware of. But you'll be able to get these slides afterwards and just sit back and have a look through this and perhaps go over it again with your team in terms of, can we think of any examples where this might crop up for our business? So, Michael, might hand over to you now to give us a bit of a view on what are the FMA's expectations when it comes to conflicts of interest. So, Judy, if you just would like to move to the next slide.
Wonderful. Thanks for that, Karty, and good morning, everyone. Unfortunately, you won't see a picture of myself. I don't have that greater Wi-Fi setup as kind of working in Auckland. Karty, just reflecting on that slide that you had up, and I might actually go back to that slide if we can, Jenny. Certainly, related parties, as you called out, is one that is quite often missed, specifically with disclosure and certainly conflicts of interest, and we think specifically, if you have a specific personal interest yourself in any form of investment, and then refer or provide advice on that investment, it's certainly one that does certainly need to be called out. So it's certainly from the FMA's perspective, one to really focus on. So thanks for that, Karty. Right, let's pop into the next slide, please. Look, a couple of areas I'd really like to draw everyone's attention to. Firstly, I'm going to talk very briefly about the conflicted remuneration, the life and health industry report that was released in May 2018, and then also secondly look at the life insurer conduct and culture report, because these are reports, although now kind of 2 years old, really set, I guess, the FMA's kind of position specifically with conflicted remuneration. So both reports available on our website if you'd like to go through and read those. So when we talk about remuneration and commissions and what soft commissions are, I really want to focus on soft commissions and what our expectations are. So we define, and we have a look at soft commissions as being incentives, benefits such as maybe gifts, prizes, trips, professional development such as training or software. Think about events including conferences, various sort of sponsorships, payments of memberships and fees, and even loans. So specifically, we're interested in soft commissions because they, to our mind, present a real conflict of interest for advisors, as remuneration or incentives provided by insurers or other providers could really influence an advisor and giving advice to that customer. And certainly, as some of the panelists have actually gone through and said, with new disclosure requirements, now is the time really to go through and bring those to the fore, and actually go through and kind of consider and ask yourselves, is what you're potentially receiving actually in the best interest of the client. So strong encouragement, if you haven't done already, please have a look at that report. It's seemed to be very kind of detailed on what we and where we see general risks within the broader industry. Second report, certainly the Life Insurer Conduct and Culture report. We spent a lot of time actually having a look at incentives. We certainly went through and called those out to a specific degree, and our request was for the industry to actually kind of revise incentives linked to sales for salespersons, all layers of management, etc. Quite critical, ensuring that if they are incentivizing, or there's any incentivization at all, it needs in some way to be actually linked back to providing good customer outcomes. So again, quite clear and defined expectations on the market there. Good governance, certainly with insurance firms, requires effective management of conflicts of interest, and certainly our view is we need to see much better systems and controls in place to manage those inherent conflicts where advisors or sales staff are offered incentives to sell or replace insurance policies. And obviously, the message today is the message that we've been giving for quite some time. Certainly fast forward through to 15 March next year, it will become even more relevant. So let's just have a look at the next slide, please. Look, certainly another strong encouragement. We released a guide to good conduct in 2017, and certainly within that guide, again, it talked quite clearly about communication and what our expectations actually are. And certainly to us and to our view, it should be quite clear to customers what they're paying in fees and expenses. So certainly providers and also advisors should be in a position to actually quite clearly and reasonably go through and explain what they are to customers, and they should be quite easily understood by customers or clients as well. So very, very critical. It's just about the transparency and making sure that clients actually understand. Thanks, Karty.
Thanks, Michael. Okay, so on the next two slides, what we've done here is just try to, again, unpick things a little bit. So here we're looking at where possible conflicts of interest could arise between an advisor and a customer. And here we can see that related person cropping up again, referral relationships, any gifts or incentives that could sort of, cloud, your thinking or your behaviours. Definitely the advisor relationship with the customer, reduced customer service for different categories based on production. So that's a really interesting one. Callbacks and poor conduct. So all these type of things, sometimes that they are good inducements, sometimes they're bad inducements. But again, any time that you consider that it's something that could influence how you deal with your client professionally, consider a conflict of interest and be very careful about it. Mitigate it where possible, avoid it if at all, but definitely be transparent about it. Okay, so on our next slide, Jenny, we are now having a look at conflicts of interest that can be caused by the relationship between the product provider and maybe the FAP or another type of licensee, or even again with the advisor directly. So it could be a lot of parties there. So product providers, they've got a job to do. They're there to give you a really high quality product and to really profile it so that you're aware of it and that you understand it. But it can also bring inherent conflicts of interest that, again, you need to manage. So at the moment, product providers are being very helpful in trying to get you as ready as possible for the new regime. So again, it means being transparent about any of those extra benefits that you might be receiving, and making sure that they aren't clouding the advice that you're giving. So we've got certain things here in terms of things like looking out for, say, legacy products, which may not be in the best interest of your client, but may still be being promoted. Maybe training that has more of a sales focus to it than actual overall competency, knowledge and skill type focus. There could be soft dollar incentives or subsidised services, such as helping you get your qualification. Some people worry about influence on things like research and so on. So it's really important to understand how tools such as research engines work, because the good ones will definitely set them up to make sure that they're not biased in favour of a product provider, and they work very hard to do that. So I think it's important to do due diligence on areas such as your research provider. And don't forget that you'll also have, or you may have, an obligation to whistleblow to the FMA if you see something in the market that really shouldn't be happening. And there's a lot of ways to do that anonymously and so on too. So again, it's just really thinking about where could potential or actual conflicts of interest arise. And don't forget that perceived conflict, even though if it may not be there in your eyes, could someone else perceive that as a conflict of interest, therefore be upfront and transparent about it and manage it. Okay, so I'm going to hand back to Alistair now, because that leads us on nicely to, well, how do you demonstrate that you've actually managed that conflict of interest?
Thanks, Karty. Yeah, so as the slide says here, my view is that duties under the FMCA and the code, they don't prohibit you from having conflicts of interest. You rather need to show that you've managed them appropriately, and to use the language of the legislation, you need to demonstrate that you've taken all reasonable steps to ensure that the advice was not materially influenced by the relevant conflicting interests. So how do you go about doing that? At this point, there's not much guidance or relevant background material to kind of point to specifically. So this just represents, I guess, my view of the reasonable steps, or the types of reasonable steps that you might think about taking in order to ensure that your advice is not materially influenced by conflicting interests. There may well be a whole range of other reasonable steps that you could or should take in your specific circumstances, and having regard to your specific business and the relevant conflicts. But at a high level, I think that you need to first of all identify and document the conflicts of interest that exist and are relevant. It's very difficult to show that you've taken all reasonable steps to manage those conflicts if you're not able to clearly demonstrate that you've thought about what they are and recorded those in some easily digestible form. You should follow a robust advice process, and it's designed to ensure that financial advice provided is suitable for the client and not what is in your interests, affects interests, or associated persons' interests. So you need to be able to demonstrate that your advice process is sort of rationally designed and picks up the relevant factors that are appropriate to the particular customer or client, and that the advice that you provided is suitable for those. You should maintain appropriate records to demonstrate the process that was followed and that all reasonable steps to manage conflicts were taken, and potentially undertake periodic reviews of client files to check advice is consistent with the client's best interests, and particularly when undertaking those reviews, kind of have the perspective of seeking to identify whether the advice was influenced by the conflicting interests. So if you see, for example, some kind of trends that show that advice has always or predominantly resulted in recommendations to acquire one particular product, and that's a product where you've identified there's a conflict of interest, then you should think about taking some action in that regard. On to the next slide, please. This is just sort of a a wrap-up slide, I guess, on the rest. So why is it important to identify and manage conflicts of interest? As we say there, where those exist, the decision-making process can be compromised in a manner that affects the integrity or the reliability of the outcomes that are provided to clients. Unmanaged conflicts of interest can undermine trust, both in your business and in the wider industry. And finally, and most loyally point, failure to adequately manage those conflicts of interest is a breach of the legislation with potential regulatory consequences for you and potentially the financial advice provider.
Thanks, Alistair. Just before we go on to the next slide, I think one thing that I'd really like to be clear about here is I've been in a room of insurance advisors and had someone from the FMA say, raise your hand if you have conflicts of interest in your business, and had very few hands go up. So, and insurance advisors, as we know, are paid by the provider to give advice to a client. So this is a very clear and very obvious conflict of interest. And I just wanted to draw a distinction between a conflict of interest existing and a conflict of interest affecting your advice. And they're not the same thing. The whole point of this process is to identify where a conflict of interest might exist and then figure out ways of making sure that it doesn't influence your advice. Okay, so I hope that really makes sense and it's really clear that your conflict of interest and having a conflict of interest, the fact that it exists, doesn't have anything to do with whether or not it affects your advice. And the whole point of this is to make sure that it doesn't influence your advice when you have a conflict of interest. Thank you, Jenny. If we can pop on to the next slide. An opportunity here for me to talk again about the disclosure requirements. And as we've got a question that has come through that's very relevant to this. Somebody asking about after the 15th of March, whether it's possible for a group of advisors have the same disclosure statement and have broad statements around the conflicts of interest that they may all share. First thing I'd like to say is please watch the disclosure webinar that we did 2 weeks ago. It's now on getinshape.nz. First thing that will make clear is from the 15th of March, there is no disclosure statement. On the 15th of March, you can take your disclosure statement and put it in the rubbish. Or if you want to, you can take it outside and light it with a lighter. It does not exist from the 15th of March. Instead, you give information to clients progressively through the process. And I encourage you also to read the disclosure guidance note that was released on Monday that is also available at getinshape.nz that will explain to you and give you very strong examples about how you can disclose and the words that you can use to disclose on the way through the process, which will be individual to the advisor. So when you've got your engagement with the advisor, it's the advisor that's disclosing to the client. So it's disclosure that's relevant between that advisor and that client. And similarly, when you're giving advice. Thank you. I think next slide, please, Jenny, is for Karty.
I know Alistair's going to lead us through these next few.
Yeah. So I'm just going to run through the specific disclosure requirements in relation to conflicts of interest, including incentives. So the first disclosure requirement, which is a requirement where if any conflict of interest other than a commission or other incentive exists or is likely to arise in the future in relation to advice given, a brief description of the nature of the conflict of interest, and a brief explanation of the steps that have been or will be taken to manage each conflict of interest. And just bearing in mind the definition of conflict of interest, which I talked about earlier, and its breadth. So we move to the next slide. As I touched on before, the conflict of interest has to be disclosed if a reasonable client would expect it to or be likely to materially influence the advice given. And that is a question, well, it's a question of fact, I guess, and it probably requires you to consider the relevant conflicts that exist and form your best view of what a reasonable client would expect in regard to that advice. The next specific disclosure requirement is a separate one for commissions or incentives. So commissions or other incentives also need to be disclosed. A commission or other incentive is a commission, benefit, or other incentive, whether monetary or non-monetary, and whether direct or indirect, that is provided to the FAP advisor or connected person, is provided as a consequence of the advisor giving the advice or the client acting on the advice. So, for example, as a consequence of the client acquiring a financial product. And again, that a reasonable client would expect to or be likely to materially influence the advice given. general points on that disclosure is, again, it's a very broad definition in terms of the language used. So it's a commission and benefit or other incentive. And I mean, a benefit is a pretty broad concept. Many things can be benefits. And then expressly whether monetary or non-monetary, and whether direct or indirect. So I think the general takeaway there is that a narrow approach to what is a commission or incentive is not the correct way to go. Clearly it captures things that aren't in cash. Clearly it captures things that are indirect benefits. And the final point I'd make is that, that it's picking up things that are the commission or other incentive needs to be provided as a consequence of the advisor giving the advice or the client acting on the advice, so there may be some classes of commission or other incentive that don't fall within that, benefits that are provided to advisors that don't fall within that because they're not provided as a consequence of giving the advice or the client acting on the advice. Next slide, please. So what do you need to disclose if there is a relevant commission or other incentive? You need to provide a brief explanation or description of the following matters: when or in what circumstances it will or may be given, who it would be given by and to whom, its amount or value, or how it will be determined. So, for example, it would be determined on a percentage rate depending on volume of sales, etc. The steps that have been or will be taken to manage the conflicts of interest, which links, I guess, to what we were talking about earlier in terms of steps that you need to take to manage your conflicts of interest. On to the next slide.
Yep,
I'll
jump in there.
Yeah.
So thanks for that, Alistair. I think that was really helpful. So what I want to do on this slide here is, I guess, just do a wee summary in terms of where the responsibilities lie. And I think it's quite helpful to remember these. So the first one is your initial disclosure happens by having information that's publicly available so that your client can search on you. So that's likely to be on your website or a bit of a handout tool if you don't have internet. And the financial advice provider is responsible for that. So that disclosure is made on their behalf. The advisor is responsible for more disclosure, and this becomes more personal to them and their situation when the nature and scope of the advice is known. So that's really that first time that you're really involved with the client, and you're providing them enough information for them to decide whether or not to engage you as their financial advisor and to do business with you. So that's why the disclosures are made at that stage. And the second time that the advisor has a responsibility is when the actual advice or the recommendations are given. So again, then your disclosure is about anything that could influence your client or your investor's decision whether or not to proceed with your advice or your recommendations. And that's why it's really important that we're more specific about our commissions, our incentives, our gifts, any conflicts of interest potentially at that point in time, because this is material to their decision making at this point. And then lastly, there's this extra responsibility if you receive a complaint to provide further information at that point. But those first three really, I think, is thinking about in the context of what type of conflicts of interest or incentives or commissions could influence my customer's decision whether or not to do business with me or to take my advice.
So, Karty, that comes back to Chris's question from before, doesn't it? Where, you know, what do the advisors have to have disclose specifically to them, and what will be broad? And as you're saying here, the stuff that's on the website will be broad about the financial advice provider and how everyone works together. And then when you're doing the stuff when the nature and scope is known and when the advice is given, that'll be very specific to the individual advisor.
Yes, correct. You know, and we've got the luxury this time that we don't have the very prescriptive regulations that set out exactly what it is that we have to disclose and the nature of it. This time, we've got to follow the new disclosure regulations, but we can apply it a lot more to the business and our situation. And it's really, again, thinking about client understanding, making sure that they understand what you're explaining to them. So you may well talk them through it, as well as maybe building it into a document. There's all sorts of ways that you can give disclosure this time around. And yes, I think thinking about it being a lot more specific and personal. I mean, if you're an AFA under the current regime, there's a lot of similarities between the primary disclosure, the upfront information about me, and then the secondary specific disclosure, which is a lot more specific to the advice that's given. So I think that there's sort of still those sort of broad similarities.
Probably Karty, I might just cut in here and Mark as well. Probably certainly an observation from the FMA under our current regime with your primary and secondary. Certainly, well, unfortunately, we don't witness enough from advisors and AFAs specifically that they are regularly reviewing their current PDSs and also, secondary. Circumstances, do change even at the most basic level. Where someone's a business address is actually changed, or their disputes resolution provider has changed and they haven't updated that information. So certainly a focus for us as we lead into or post 15 March, our monitoring and enforcement plan will again a focus on making sure that the information is kept up to date and it is relevant, and importantly, as panelists have said, is actually easily understood. So maybe just a wee bit of an insight there. That is what we will certainly be focused on from March 15th, 2021 onwards.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Right.
And just before we go on to the next slide, we've had a great question come in from someone who's interested in our views around how to best identify conflicts of interest in organisations where there's multiple financial advisors. So if, for example, could they do annual declarations? Would they disclose it during the hiring process? Would they ask, have a manager to declare it on a one-off basis, or how should this be done? And moreover, what a conflicts of interest register that's held by the organisation, should it be regularly reviewed?
Yeah, I might just pick up on that one, and I'll pick on FMA specifically. Certainly, as an employee of the FMA, I have a conflicts. The FMA runs a conflicts of interest register. I need when I started several years ago, needed to complete those, and we also need maybe 6 months to go through and just provide an updated attestation or make any sort of any changes, and also going to notify our line managers. So my recommendation is these documents should always be regularly updated and tested, and it is a good exercise to be involved in, as part of any form of compliance assurance testing, etc. Go through and regularly review these, because conflicts do change.
Yeah, look, I'd absolutely agree with that. Conflicts of interest, they pop up all over the place. I like to do the whiteboard exercise. I like to sort of just do the mind mapping to say, what are all our potential conflicts of interest, and do that with a team, because the answers lie within the team. People think of more together when you do that sort of whiteboard exercise. The disclosure register, the conflicts of interest register is a really good idea. But again, it will get out of date quickly unless you're actually actively thinking about it and keeping it up to date. Most directors are really good about that. They normally start every board meeting by reviewing their interest register and bring it up to date. But I think as a team, and I think in a fast-moving world, we've got a lot of regulatory change. We've got a lot of activity happening there with different product providers as well as clients. I would say do the brainstorming exercise on a regular basis, and it really helps not only to flesh out potential conflicts of interest, but to help cement people's understanding as well.
So you're kind of combining the process of identifying conflicts with training and conflicts of interest at the same time, aren't you?
Yeah, absolutely. Repeating
that training on a regular basis, and we've also come out there not just having going out to all your financial advisors and saying update the register, and then thinking it's going to be done. You've got to have somebody independently checking that it's been updated and making sure that everybody's been through and doing it. And then, as Karty says, having everyone get together, do a little bit of training and prompt them to think about the different areas where they might have conflicts, so they can write them down as they go and then update the register. Absolutely. So hopefully that answers the question for you, Richard. Sorry, class is on. Richard, my apologies. So if we can pop to the next slide. Up to me now to kind of ask some questions. So I want to start with, actually, Michael, you might be the best person to ask this. What types of gifts should be disclosed?
Look, I work on the simple basis is just be absolutely transparent about everything. And quite often we get but I've just received a bottle of wine, and look, and it's absolutely fine to receive a bottle of wine. And I guess ultimately, then it's that transparency, and you ask yourself, is this best interest in clients? Has it gone through and influenced any of my recommendations? No, it hasn't. But I guess it's how you build your relationships and what you want your clients to ultimately know, and how close you should be getting to them. So look, our advice is any gifts that you personally feel that you may well have or may well go through and influence the ultimate outcome.
So when you're talking about disclosing it in your statements around your in your statement of advice or in your engagement letter, and we know that financial advisors will quite often be out for a coffee with their BDMs, or a lot of small stuff may happen. They might be out to dinner, they might get tickets to a game. At what point, we had some advisors recently go to the Cup Day in Christchurch. At what point should these things be disclosed? If you disclosed every coffee that you went out for with a BDM, you'd be there all day.
Yeah, look, and we certainly don't prescribe any form of monetary threshold. I guess what it is, it's certainly up to the advisor then to think, what I have received at all, has that gone through and influenced me in any way, shape, or form? But certainly, look, I wouldn't have thought a coffee with a BDM. But if you use your example of going to Cup Day, well, gosh, was that a paid for trip? Was there any form of qualifying? What also happened surrounding that trip to the races?
Cool. Okay. Thank you, Michael. Also, if I can ask you the next question, being the lawyer in our midst, how do you define an incentive?
How do I define an incentive? I think, well, in terms of the legislation, as I mentioned, it's very broad. So any form of commission or monetary benefit, whether monetary or non-monetary, that's provided as a consequence of providing the advice. So it could encompass, if you provide, or as a consequence of the client acting on the advice. So anything that is determined and provided to you by reference to the decisions that your clients make following receipt of your advice, and that is a benefit to you, whether monetary or non-monetary, falls within the definition of an incentive. So I think that's quite a long-winded way of saying, very broadly, is how I would define an incentive. Yeah.
Could you want to add anything to that, Karty?
Look, I think sometimes it's helpful to have a starting point as a business and agree a threshold. So when we advise businesses on drafting their policies for conflicts of interest and gifts and incentives, we normally have some sort of gifting type policy, and the business describes how they're going to deal with gifts. Lots of businesses have some really creative ideas that they'll put all the gifts into like a pool and automatically share it with the whole team to try and reduce that sort of one person type incentive. And some of them will just start with a threshold level. It could be as low as $50. Some businesses have it higher than that, say $250, where they just make sure that they take extra care once it's at that threshold level or above, because they know that, in the eyes of the outside world, it could be seen as something more significant. So having an internal threshold, I think, certainly can help. If it's pretty high, I would imagine Michael and his team would raise their eyebrows and challenge you on it if they came for a monitoring visit. So I think it's really got to be realistic for the size of your business and what could be seen. Again, conflicts of interest is something that's viewed by somebody externally. So take that external viewpoint on it.
Three of us have had time at the FMA, and I remember that we've got an FMA gift register. So all staff, when they were given something that was over the value of $50, register, and there were approaches around gifting it and so forth. On gifting those sorts of incentives. Is that something that you'd recommend for financial advice providers? Should they have a gift register? Should they have a process about what they accept and what they give to charity and so forth?
Yeah, absolutely. We do. We recommend that. I mean, unfortunately, in compliance, you tend to have registers for Africa. But what I do is I put them all on one spreadsheet so that they're really easy to manage. And then maybe have one tab per register, and then they're all in one place. So just record them as a good, simple way for helping manage them and being transparent about them. And
I'll just pick up there.
Yep.
Yeah. Sorry, Karty, we certainly from an FMA's perspective, we've made this kind of quite loud and clear across a lot of our monitoring, don't just tell me, show me. So yeah, we're doing on-site monitoring specifically, and someone has a gift register. Well, you've made 2 steps forward because you're actually considering these and registering them. So it's certainly, I recommend that as a bit of a prudent step forward. So I'd encourage it.
So we'd expect that all financial advice providers should have a gift register. You might have a de minimis threshold, so if it's under $50, you wouldn't worry about putting it on the register, but or whatever amount the business decides. But everything over that should be entered on the register, and somebody should be regularly reviewing the register and going down the list and looking for things that go, actually, that one's a bit strange. I'm going to talk to that financial advisor about it and just make sure that everything's okay. So is it something along those lines?
Look, your de minimis amount of $50 is a lot, Mark. Goodness me, you've been out of the FMA far too long. But certainly, it certainly would go through and encourage people to go through and keep a gift register and leave it up to everyone's individual circumstances and thoughts about what they'd actually go through and put on that list.
You raise a good point there, Michael. What would be your view of a reasonable de minimis threshold?
Look, it's hard to say, but you accept a coffee, but from say a BDM, maybe you were seeing him or her twice a day and every day, Monday through Friday. We could argue quite quickly, then that's probably totaling up. What else is happening? So look, it's all down to individual circumstance, and again, I come back to the point is ask yourself, is what you're actually receiving in the best interest of the client? Is it unnecessarily influencing outcomes?
Important point you raised, that it's not just the value of the gift, but also the frequency and the context that the gift is provided, and those sorts of things are very important as well.
There's been a really good question come in, Mark, that I think that we should answer and just get maybe Michael and Alistair's view on. So the question is, should giving a referral money, say $250 for referring a client to an advisor, would it be treated as a gift and be disclosed in any money, or should it be treated as a gift and disclosed in any manner?
So that's a... Can I put my video on? So my technical lawyer answer to that in the context of the new financial advice regime under FMCA would be that the referring somebody to get financial advice from somebody else is not providing financial advice. And the provisions regulating conflicts of interest apply in connection with the giving of financial advice. So I think that technically you could argue, and you'd probably be correct, that that is not something that is regulated within the purview of the financial advice regime that will be created under FMCA. As to whether, as a matter of good practice and good conduct, you should take a different approach, well, I think the FMA would probably say yes. And it's something that you should probably consider third.
Thank you, Alistair. We would say yes to that.
And
Yeah.
should the
And then
recipient-
again, it depends on the amount as well. But again, I just come back to my base point. It's displaying to us that you actually have considered this.
So that was, the case of the recipient receiving the money. We're saying it's good practice to then disclose that, put it on your register and so forth. And what about the person that's paying the referral fee? Should they be disclosing that anyway to clients or on their register internally?
Well, I mean, again, I'd give the same. I don't think that. So for no, it's the short answer in terms of the legal requirements. I think for the person paying a referral fee, just to another advisor to refer clients to them, I can't see there's any specific requirement to disclose it. But again, as a matter of good practice, it's probably something that you would want, in the interest of transparency, to be transparent about.
Yeah, and look, as we often know, referrals quite often do not lead to any business being actually issued as well. So there's that real balance here. But certainly, it depends how far you go through with your register. But it may well again display to us the FMA. It's a type of client acquisition tool, and obviously not always successful. So
As Alistair says, although it may not legally be required, I'd certainly, if I were a financial advisor referring a client to another person, I'd want to make it clear to my client that, look, I've got a relationship with this advisor, that they give me a fee if you take up their advice. So while I don't work with them,
Actually, I've just given a moment's more thought to that question. So whilst it is not, I would say, regulated under the advice provisions under FMCA, the Secret Commissions Act of 1908, which is often forgotten about, still exists and is a piece of legislation that is enforceable by FMA under its legislation. And it's kind of difficult to interpret because it was written in 1908, so it's not very clear. But there may be an argument that's a commission that's within the purview of the Secret Commissions Act and therefore requires to be disclosed to the person to whom you're recommending they enter into an agreement with somebody else.
Yeah, thank you for raising that. I'd forgotten about that act, and it's very important.
People often do. Indeed, I did. So
in both of those cases, whether you're giving the referral fee or receiving the referral fee, it would certainly be worthwhile disclosing that to the client. And I'm sure Michael's just made a note of the Secret Commissions Act to have a little power about that internally in the FMA and bring it up. So I'd definitely make sure that I would disclosing that. And the next question that we've got on here is around soft dollar benefits and the FMA's view. And I find this particularly interesting because I had a conversation with an advisor yesterday when I was in Christchurch and talking about how incentives help advisors get up in the morning and give advice. And so if an advisor is incentivized to provide that activity, they will be out there giving more advice to more New Zealanders. And if all incentives were completely removed, we'd have less financial advice activity and therefore less access to financial advice for New Zealanders. So with that context, Michael, what's your view on soft dollar benefits?
Oh, look, thanks for that, Mark. I guess we've certainly made our point kind of quite loud and clear. We certainly, our concern is a potential conflict of interest posed by the soft commissions, e.g., we would always refer to as example overseas trips, and these kind of COVID's put that to a bit of an end now, but certainly even internal trips and that potential impact on customer outcome. Look, I guess our strong encouragement is again to how and where is the benefit to the end consumer. What does it actually mean for the advice provided, and are consumers' best interests actually being served. And I guess there's always probably an argument, a bit of a prudential argument here as well, because any form of incentivization over commission, that does cost, and that money has to be found somewhere, and who ultimately pays the premiums that consumers pay.
So would it ultimately then come down to the design of the incentive? So, for example, if a financial advice provider with 50 or 100 advisors has their own internal incentives, they're also going to be very careful with the way they design those incentives, because if they're all about, for example, getting new business, that's not necessarily in the best interest of clients. So they need to have some quality or client outcomes context to their incentive programs to make sure that they're inspiring their advisors to get out of bed and go and get new clients and look after clients, but they're doing it in a way that the client's getting the best possible outcomes.
Look, yeah, exactly right, and certainly our message has been quite unwavering. Where incentivization is based on volume of sales. It's there's quite a disconnect between good customer outcomes, right? So you must again have a look at how you're designing and what the key metrics for these actually are, and again, is it serving the best interests of consumers?
Great. Yeah, thank you, Michael. Just tidying up this point about referrals, there's a question that's come in about whether it's okay if a client gives you a referral to give them a gift card to say, hey, thanks very much, or $200 or something to say thanks for the referral, and then giving the referral partner a few $100s there. Is that okay? Well, I'm hoping that what we've put across here is that it's okay to do that, but just make sure you disclose it. And in particular, in the case of giving the gift to the client after they've given you a referral, that's clearly a thank you. It's not so much an incentive at that point. It's saying, hey, thanks so much for doing this thing for me. I really appreciate it. Here's a gift. So, there's kind of this distinction between in the context of the gift. Is it requiring or an expectation of future activity, or is it a thank you for something that's already happened in the past? So there's that kind of overlay as well. Final question here. Are there any occasions when you should decline a gift? Anybody want to speak to that question?
I'll jump in here. Look, absolutely. There's going to be times where the gift is disproportionate to the work that you've done or the relationship that you have with the other party. I think this is sort of a good conduct in an ethical situation where sometimes you just have to make a business decision and weigh up, is the perception of a conflict or an incentive on this gift so significant that it would outweigh the good that it could do, and you should have a good process and then make good judgment calls. But I think most advisor businesses know when they should decline a gift, or they should have a discussion with their advisors about it.
Kind of got to be careful accepting gifts that come with an expectation that you're going to do something in future that may not be for the best benefit of clients in particular, right? Is that kind of
Absolutely.
Thank you. If we can move on to the next slide now, I think, Karty, would you mind summarising for us?
In summary, as you're starting to contemplate your new world as a licensee, the importance of tone at the top really can't be underestimated. So that's really where it all starts. The ethics, the conduct, the expectations, the no shades of grey, and really encouraging your advisors to identify and manage and be transparent about any conflicts of interest, gifts or incentives that come across your desk. Transparency is the key. Clients understand that sometimes these type of things, it's just part of normal business practice, but being transparent about it so that there's no surprises for them later on. Remember to keep sensitive information confidential. I think that's really an important part of this as well. And culture. Culture is huge. So conflicts of interest can really undermine a good culture within an organisation by letting poor management of conflicts of interest bring an undercurrent to a business. So really think about having the right culture, being transparent, and getting people to identify and talk about conflicts of interest. And that finally comes up with no shades of grey. If you're uncertain about whether or not there's a conflict of interest, whether or not this is a gift you should record, something you should talk about, err on the side of caution. Don't have any shades of grey when it comes to this. And I think we've got a little bit of homework for you on the next slide.
Before we go, Karty? I wonder whether I could just...
So your outtakes from this hopefully are establish a conflicts of interest policy if you don't have one already. And part of that will be establishing and having a conflicts of interest register, preferably also a gift register as well. You can combine them all into one so that you don't have too many registers if you're a small business. And really think about how you're going to draft your explanations for the new disclosure. We're lucky enough that we've still got a few months up our sleeve before we've really got to put those new disclosure explanations together. There might be something that you're giving verbally, some information on your website, but also things that you might be adding to your documents. Now's the time to start mapping those out, working out what you're going to say. And again, if I can do a bit of a plug for the FSC disclosure document, there's some really good examples and hints for how you can word those in that document. So that's it from me, Mark.
Thank you, Karty. We also had a really good discussion. Some great points came out, as you just reiterated there again, about a process to keep this nice and clean. Having a spreadsheet, as Karty says, with multiple tabs for your different registers, and on that you'll have your conflicts of interest register, you'll have your gift register, along with things like your training register and other things as well. We talked about getting together sort of every 6 months or every year with your advisors and doing some training on conflicts of interest and gifts, and then whiteboarding all the different types of conflicts so that people can be writing them down and using that then to update the conflicts register, having somebody in the business check that conflicts register on a periodic basis to make sure that it's been updated regularly, and keeping track of these things over time is really, really important. That'll all be, how you do that will all be written down in your conflicts of interest policy, your gifts and incentives policy, and so forth. And of course, when you do that training, you record in your training register, and that process will be written down in your training policy. So it all kind of fits together really, really neatly. You've got your policy about how you do things, the training that you do to get people to do it, and then the process of filling in those registers, and then the process of checking that the registers are being filled in. So that together makes it quite complete. And together with all of that, we've discussed things like referral fees and those sorts of things, and being open and transparent with your client and talk to your client about, yes, I'm going to give you a referral to this different advisor for this other product. If I'm an insurance advisor, maybe to a mortgage advisor, but I'll tell the client that I've got a relationship with that advisor and they'll give me a share of the commission, or they'll give me a fee for the referral. So those sorts of things are going to be very important. And it was great to pull out the Secret Commissions Act at that point. So thank you. If we can move on to the next slide, I just want to talk a little bit very briefly about the next webinar. Before I do that, a huge thank you to our high-powered team that we had in the presentation this morning. Karty Mayne from Rosewill Consulting, Alistair Robertson from MinterEllisonRuddWatts, and Michael Hewes from the FMA. We have a really great collection of expertise and skill that participate in this webinar, and they've donated their time to help you prepare. So I hope you really appreciate the stuff that's been put forward for you. The next webinar that we're going to do is the 13th webinar in the series. It'll be the last one for 2020. We'll kick off again in 2021. And what we'll do in the next webinar is kind of give you a brief summary of the first 12 webinars. So it'll be a nice summary, a really good webinar to come along to get a feel of what we've done so far, and to give you a pointer about the sorts of webinars you might be interested in going and rewatching or watching for the first time on getinshape.nz if you haven't seen them before. We'll also talk a little bit about the February Get in Shape Advice Summit series that we'll do in 2021, which will be another fantastic event as we had in February this year, and the Navigating Regulation Roadshow that we had the year before. So keep your eye out for that. That'll be on Friday, the 27th of November at 10 a.m. And look at getinshape.nz for details, or contact the FSC on the email address you see to subscribe to the updates. Thank you very much for coming. If you came to the live webinar, I apologise for the cutting out, and you'll see this the tail end of the webinar on the recording. Have a great day, and I'll look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.